Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for stopping by. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create this card here where I'm coloring the image in with glitter. So if you use transparent glitter, you can use it as a stained glass card because you'll be able to see through it. Most of the glitters here were opaque, so you can't actually see through them. So the very first step is taking your stamp, stamping it with StazOn or a permanent ink that is good for non-porous surfaces, and we're going to stamp the image onto some acetate. Now you'll notice I have a sentiment right on my stamp that I'm stamping onto this acetate. It's important to actually flip your acetate over so that you can read the sentiment at the end, and I'll elaborate more in a little bit. So I'm using some art glitter glue, and I love this glue for this technique because it dries completely clear, and that way you get to see the glitter through it. If you have a glue that doesn't dry completely clear, you won't actually be able to see the glitter, so that is an important thing here. So I'm using the color palette that you see on the top. I'm doing 2 colors at a time and then letting them dry in between. It doesn't need to be 100% dry, but mostly dry. And the way you know it's dry is if you flip it over and you don't see any white left from that glue. So you're just going to use the pointed tip of the glue bottle to fill in the different areas of the stamp. And it's important to go from darkest color to lightest color when you're doing this technique. Especially if you're doing a couple colors at a time, if you use a light color and then go into a dark color, you'll often get spots of that dark color in with the white or the light color, especially if your glue is still wet, and that can affect the final result. So always easiest to line up your glitters and go from darkest to lightest so that you get a perfect result at the end. And what you don't see here, I'm letting the 2 colors that I'm doing at a time dry for probably about an hour between steps so that it is safe to continue. On the areas where I'm putting glue in larger areas, I'm not actually tapping off my excess glitter. I'm just leaving it on there and letting it dry for about an hour, and then I'll tap it off. And if you get any glitter that likes to stick to the acetate because of static, you can just use a soft brush and lightly brush it right off of the acetate. And that usually takes care of it. Another thing you could use is, say, a Swiffer cloth, but usually a light brush or a soft brush works perfectly. So this obviously will work with any stamp. It just needs to be an outline stamp that has areas that you can color in. And like I said before, if you choose transparent glitters, this can be a stained glass card because you'll be able to see light through it as long as you put an opening in both your card and your mat that goes on front. And I did do that on this card, although I did use glitters that were opaque, so you can't really see through them other than the white. I did create the card with a see-through opening. When you see it at the end, you can actually see the glitter on the back of the card. In order to eliminate that or to protect that, you could either use a piece of shelf liner, clear shelf liner, to encase the glitter so that it looks a little bit prettier, or even a piece of vellum would work for that as well. Just something that is transparent, you can see the light through. The vellum would hide the glitter a little bit more, but it just really depends on the look you're going for, or really if that glitter bothers you at all. Typically this glue seals it in really well, so there's not going to be a lot of flakes that fall off of it. But your choice. If you don't like the look of it on the inside and you want to hide it, then just use a piece of vellum just to hide it and be a little bit more subtle with it. So because of the technique here, because there's a big opening or open area, I do use glitter on that as well, so that the entire image is covered in glitter. I just think it looks a little bit prettier. You don't necessarily have to. If you want to have some clear areas, you can absolutely do that. I just personally prefer it with the entire area completely covered. And I do have this video sped up to twice the speed, just for time-wise, basically. The only thing you want to be sure is when you're putting your glue down, you want to make sure that your area that you're wanting to cover is completely covered. And if you happen to have any bubbles, just take a pin, or I've used a die pick that's nice and clean, and just pop those bubbles so that you don't have any open areas without any glitter. They usually pop really, really quick and really, really easy. And obviously this background here, because it's such a large area, it takes a lot longer than an hour to dry. So I actually let it dry overnight, and there was still an area that wasn't quite completely dry. So it is a technique that does require some patience. It's perfect if you're wanting to work on several at one time, so then you can have them all drying and you're not going to spend a lot of time on just one card. You can get more than one done. But it's a fun technique, a great way to use up glitter if you have a lot, and I have a very large collection of glitter. And especially for holiday cards, it just kind of adds a wow factor that, and it's unique, which is one of the reasons I love doing it. I was taught this technique, I want to say about 25 years ago, so it's definitely not something new. It's something that I learned a long, long time ago, but it's just a fun one to go back to. So my last color is the Snowman, which is the white glitter, or it's actually clear, the one that I'm using, but it just shows up as white. And do that last for sure, because you want to make sure that everything is good. This is the point where I realized that my sentiment was backwards because I hadn't flipped my acetate over. So just be sure, if you put a sentiment, or if you stamp a sentiment on your acetate, be sure to flip it over before you start the glitter. I do fix it at the end, and I'll show you how I fixed it. So I'm using a rectangle die on my matte piece for the front of my card. I'm just centering it and then taping it in place, and then I'm going to cut it. And I'm going to do the same thing for the front of the card. Once again, if you choose glitters that are opaque, that you can't see through, you don't necessarily need to do this for your card base. And that would also hide the glitter if you have opaque glitters. But I'm just showing you how to do it so that if you want to put that opening in both your card base and your mat that goes around your image, you can. So once again, for the card base, I have my card folded in half, place my die, tape it in place, and then I open it up to cut through it. If you don't open up your card, you're going to cut through your back, or at the very least, you're going to put an impression of that die in the back. So once those two pieces are cut, you can take the rectangle die out, and then I use a nice double-sided tape on my acetate piece in order to glue the mat to it. You definitely want to use a nice double-sided tape for this. For part of this, you can use a liquid glue, but especially for the mat going onto the acetate piece, the double-sided tape is just going to stick better. Liquid glue takes a little while to dry, especially if you're gluing it to acetate. So this was just a little bit quicker. So I'm putting my tape on the inside of my frame, and then I'm going to pull those ends off of it and center my image how I would like it in that mat. If by chance there's a little bit of acetate that sticks outside of that mat, you can just use the scissors and trim it off. You definitely don't want that visible. It's not a pretty part of this technique, so I would definitely cut it off. You'll notice when I go to glue this piece onto my card front, I'll use my double-sided tape on the outside of the mat to glue it down, and then I'm using some distressed collage medium. That's just showing you there my sentiment that is backwards and my glue that's actually not dry quite yet, but I can still do this part without messing anything up because it's mostly dry. What was I saying? Oh, so when I go to glue this piece onto the front of my card, I'll use my double-sided tape around the edges of this mat because there's not a lot of glitter there, so I can get some really good contact with the acetate and the tape. And then I will use some distressed collage medium right on the card base on the inside of the frame so that that can get glued right to the glitter part of my image there. That way I get the best of both worlds. The tape will hold it down while that liquid glue is drying against the glitter. Double-sided tape doesn't really work really well against glitter or glitter paper, and therefore the liquid glue, and using the two of them together. Once I have that double-sided tape down around the edges, you'll notice that I press down around it. I like to make sure that that tape has really good contact with the acetate, and it also ends up taking the backing paper off of the adhesive a little bit easier. Sometimes if you don't actually do that, you tend to pull up some of the tape as well. So by pressing it down and making sure that it's stuck really well to the piece that you are trying to glue, it helps you take the backing paper off. So here is the Distress Collage medium. The Distress Collage medium, it dries completely matte, so if anything happens to seep through, you're not actually going to see it, but it also works really well on non-porous surfaces, which makes it perfect for gluing to this glitter. The matte is cut just a little bit smaller than my front of my card base, so I can just easily center that in the middle of the card base, and my piece is down there. I just need to wait for that glue to dry. So to fix my sentiment, I am taking a piece of white cardstock here, stamping that sentiment with the same black StazOn onto that white card base, and then I'm taking my mini trimmer and I'm just going to cut that sentiment into strips. I kind of thought strips would look a little bit more interesting than, say, one big block of a sentiment. I thought it would look a little bit out of place if it was just one big chunk. So I'm taking my trimmer and cutting in between. This particular sentiment isn't super, the lines aren't super straight. Some of the letters are a little bit cockeyed. So it does make it a little bit challenging to cut it evenly, but it's enough, or it can be done. And if by chance it couldn't, I would just use a larger area. I cut it in a larger area so the sentiment was complete, and then maybe mat it in a different color just to make it look more intentional. Now I'm cutting the ends off of those sentiments, and I'm going to take some foam tape and put it on the back of each one of them so they're popped up a little bit. Now I didn't actually do it with this card, but what I probably would do, because there's that element there that's popped up, in order to balance that, I would probably take some, say, holly die cuts or something and put them in the bottom left corner of the image just to get a little bit more dimension in a different area to make that sentiment look a little bit more intentional. But like I said, I didn't do that with this one. I wanted to keep it as simple as possible and just show you what a possible fix if you happen to do the same as I did and forget to turn your your acetate. Another option would be to not even stamp the sentiment right on the acetate until the card is completely done, and then you can position it and stamp it then. That way, if you accidentally forgot to turn it over and make the sentiment correct, that would fix it right there. Or that would completely eliminate that whole thing. So the pop dots I'm using here are still quite thin. They do pop it up and give it some dimension, but they're not really, really thick pop dots, so it's not kind of outrageous. If by chance you didn't have any pop dots, you could glue that right down to your card. Or if you wanted some dimension but didn't have pop dots, you could use just some thin strips of cardstock behind it just to give it a little bit of dimension that way. So there is my finished card. That's the inside part, and like I said, that's the part if you didn't like it, you could put some vellum over it to cover it. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. I hope you have a fabulous day.